A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Vertraut und Schabbat, es ist getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Kevin.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Katnusas.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Welcome, everyone, to Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Geberer with another episode of Jewish History Soundbites. And before we start, I just want to remind you that you can be in touch with me at yehudageberer.com for sponsorships and doing all types of creative lectures online, Zoom, for your events or simchas or family get-togethers or whatnot, and virtual tours, so can be in touch with me about that as well. It's becoming more and more popular lately, so I just wanted to put it out there. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Brisker Rov and his family with their arrival in Israel in the 1940s, and they escaped from the war, and a little bit about the family. I'm calling it part one because I imagine that this is a big enough topic that we can get to many more, and there's always a lot of stories, and people very often enjoy Brisker stories and about the Brisker family, the Soloveitchiks. We're talking specifically about the Israel branch in here. There's an apocryphal story. I'll start with that. Just get us into the mood of the Brisker Rov and his family, and what does a Brisker story mean, which probably never happened, but it gives a sense of what it's all about here. That the Rav's daughter, the Brisker Rov, of course, is Rav Yitzchok Zev Soloveitchik, known also as Velvalleh Soloveitchik. He was the youngest son of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, or Reb Chaim Brisker, who was the rabbi in Brisk after his father, Reb Dovid Soloveitchik, the Beis Halevi. And Reb Chaim afterwards was also the rabbi of Brisk, and then later Reb Velvalleh was also the last rabbi of Brisk till the war, and he's known to posterity not just as Rav Yitzchok Zev or Reb Velvalleh or any other title, but most belovedly and most well known as the Brisker Rov, or just the Rov, and he escapes the war and comes to Israel with a portion of his family in 1941, which we'll get to. And one of his daughters is one of the more famous daughters who he comes with, Lifsheh. And so the way this apocryphal story goes is that the Rav is soon to be lighting Hanukkah candles, and there's a broom near the menorah, near where he's going to light his Hanukkah candles. And so Lifsheh takes away the broom. And the Brisker Rov says, "Why are you taking away the broom from next to the menorah?" And she says, "Because I imagine some of your students are going to come and watch how you light the Hanukkah candles. And they're going to see that the broom is here. So they're going to assume that the Brisker Rov is of the position that you must have a broom next to your Hanukkah menorah when you light the candles." So the Brisker Rov smiles and says, "You didn't really accomplish anything by taking the broom away, because then my students will assume that you must have a broom near the Hanukkah candles, and right before you light, you're supposed to take it away." And that is an insight into understanding the Rav's family and the nature of the Brisker story. I remember when I was in the Meir Yeshiva, so one of my Rebbeim there was Rav Rephoel Shmulevitz, the son of Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, the Meir Yeshiva, and he used to give an annual shiur. He gave many shiurim. He gave an annual shiur on his father's yard site on Gimel Teves every year, the day after the end of Chanukah, and I missed it one year. It was the yard site shiur in the Beis Medrash, and I went over to Rephoel afterwards, the day later or later that day, I don't remember, and I said, I apologize, I wasn't able to make the shiur. Can you tell me basically what it was about, the idea, give me a summary, the lowdown on what the shiur was about? So we sat down and we started discussing it, and he tells me the shiur, and he said I quoted my father's position on the sugya, and I asked some questions, and then I went with a different way. I went with my own way, and he explains to me his way. So I say to him, what do you mean? You're saying a shiur on your father's yard site and you didn't agree with his position? You argued on it and went differently? And he looks at me and he says, Das hab ich gewollt, de Vater. He would call his father the father. He wouldn't say tati or daddy or anything. He said, this is what my father would have wanted. He wants us to argue and to have our own way. That's exactly what my father wanted. And then he ends off with a twinkle in his eye, and he says, "Ich bin nicht kein Brisker." I'm not a Brisker, meaning that the Brisker way is to do exactly like the father, vidatata, exactly how the father did it in the exact tradition, and that's a very strong characteristic of Brisk in general and of the family of the Brisker Rov in Israel, to try to not deviate anything from what the Brisker Rov ever did. So we start with the Rav's escape from Europe. The Rav had bad asthma, he had a lot of health issues, and he would spend several months a year away from his community, away from Brisk, because the doctors told him he needs to work on his health and be in resort areas with better air and the mountains and fresh air. Very weak, struggled his entire life. He always went on walks and exercise and be in these resorts. And even when he was in Israel, he used to go to Switzerland every summer. So the Rav the Brisker Rov was in Krenitz, one of his favorite resorts. He was there very often, almost every year, for several months in the summer. And of course, we know the war breaks out in September, so that finds him in Krenitz, in the resort when the war breaks out. I saw one book brings that the war broke out the week of Slichus. It definitely did not break out the week of Slichus. It broke out a week or two before that. But okay, who's getting picky on when exactly the World War II broke out? Either way, so he goes from Krenitz, which is in the south of Poland, in Galicia, to Warsaw, to the capital. He gets a train to Warsaw, and from there he wants to go east to Brisk, but the trains aren't running regularly. He's not able to make it to Brisk, so he's stuck in Warsaw for the holidays. He gets an esrig and a lulav, a whole story, and he makes it to Vilna, and he spends the next year or so, in a little over a year, in Vilna, and he tries to get the rest of his kids with him. He at the time was only with his oldest son, Rav Berel, Soloveitchik, who we'll get to in a minute, and then he sends telegrams and letters to his wife and to send the rest of the kids, and then she should come and they'll get visas. In either way, the Brisker Rov is able to get a visa, and he eventually makes it out. And while he was in Vilna, actually, he was there for Pesach of 1940. Interesting story. The Brisker Rov was very particular about using hand matzahs. And in Vilna, as in most places, the Litvaks, they used machine matzahs. And Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski went so far to have that they didn't have any hand matzah bakeries in Vilna under the auspices of Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski and during his tenure as the rabbi in Vilna. And the Reb Chaim Ozer, everyone used machine matzahs. Reb Chaim Ozer and all the other rabbanim in Vilna, they're only machine. And because of the great respect that the Reb Chaim Ozer had for the Brisker Rov, although he was his junior by quite a few years, Reb Chaim Ozer arranged for an old hand matzah baker that had been closed many years before to be able to have a run for that Pesach, just to be able to provide for the Brisker Rov the specific hand matzahs that he wanted. as the respect that he had for the Brisker Rov. So, in any event, the Rav makes it out in 1941, but he wasn't able to get everyone out. He was with he took 6 of his children with him, and eventually his oldest son, Rav Berel, made it out on his own. He also got a visa, so he had 7 children with him. But the Brisker Rov originally actually he had 12 children. 2 children had passed away as young infants, unfortunately. But the Rebbitzin Alte Hindel, who was actually in Auerbach, a very old, prestigious Yerushalmi family who had moved back to Europe, so she, also a very special woman, and a very special Rebbitzin to the Brisker Rov. There's also a lot to say about her. But she's in Brisk with 3 of the younger kids. And she's supposed to make it to Vilna and pick up the visas that the Rav was able to arrange for her and the other children. And she wasn't able to make it to Vilna. So the Rav leaves with 6 kids. Rav Berel is still behind. And the Rebbitzin, his mother, comes to Vilna to pick up the visas. And that day the visa office was closed. She was not able to get it. She meets with her son, and that was the last family member to have met with her. And she says she's going to make another attempt to come to Vilna to get the visas. In the meantime, Rav Berel himself, his turn comes to leave. He makes it out, and then she sends a letter to the Brisker Rov in Eretz Yisrael saying that she is not able to. The road to Vilna has already been closed. She can't make it to pick up the visas. She was stuck. And she and the 3 children were killed when the Nazis later, in the summer of 1941, invaded the Soviet Union, and the Jews of Brisk were killed in a great mass grave outside of Brisk. Very terrible and tragic story. So the Rav is now in Israel and comes there in 1941 through Odessa and Turkey and Syria and Lebanon. He finally makes it to Eretz Yisrael, and he settles down in Yerushalayim. And he is a single father with young kids, young children. Some of them were older, but some of them were younger. So it's, we look at the human side of the story here. He has to raise these children on his own. He did not remarry, and it was a challenge, definitely a difficult situation. But the Brisker Rov was the Brisker Rov, and he was able to persevere, and he had, pretty amazing children. And we're going to talk a little bit about each one of those children. There's so much to say, but perhaps, like I said, we'll get to it, get to a more complete profile in a part 2 or part 3 or whatever it is. So you have his oldest son, who I mentioned already, Rav Berel. In Europe, he was his father's right-hand man. He was the oldest. And he would accompany his father in his trips to the resort, to Krenitz and other places. And he later on marries a Weinstein. Her father was a Novardiker, a student of Novardik. She was actually a grandchild of Rabbi Yeshua Zimblist, who was a Rav in Minsk and later on lived in Yerushalayim. And actually, Rav Berel passed away in 1981, but his wife survived him by quite a few decades. She only passed away several years ago. I remember it wasn't that long ago, just a couple of years ago. And there was a story going around, again, one of these Brisker stories that either you appreciate or you don't. And in her later years, she didn't speak. She didn't talk at all. And someone at the Shiva asked Rav Berel's son, who's the current Rosh Yeshiva in Brisk, Rav Mishua Soloveitchik, as to where does this not talking at all come from? Does it come from Brisk, or does it come from Novardik, from her parents' home? So, why didn't she speak? So he said she didn't speak because she didn't want to. She was scared that she would say nonsense. She said the word that they used, probably meant to use, was shtuyot or shtuyos, but they said it in a yeshivish way, shtusim. She didn't want to say any shtusim, so she didn't talk at all. So the question is, does that custom come from Brisk or from Novardik? And Rav Yeshua answered, Nicht reden shtusim efshe kumt von Novardik, aber zu wissen, ob se shtusim oder nit, das kommt nur von Brisk. To not talk nonsense perhaps comes from Novardik. The Musar idea to not speak nonsense, to not say nonsensical things. But to know what is nonsense and what is not nonsense, that definitely you need the Brisker mind for. That's a very classic Brisker story. Rav Berel was essentially the one who opened the Brisker Yeshiva. Talmidim loved him, very beloved. I've spoken to several students of Rav Berel, speak about him with an awe till today. In that context, it's interesting that some of them call him Rav Berel, and some of them call him Rabbi Yashaber, like his famous cousin in America, who's also sometimes referred to as Rabbi Yashaber or the Rav. And he opens the yeshiva in his father's apartment. And his father's apartment was not owned by him. He had rented it, a special type of rental in Yerushalayim, unique to Yerushalayim, called Schlüsselgeld, which is a special type of rental. The economic transaction is perhaps the details of which we can discuss another time. But his younger brother, Rav Rephoel, who also we'll get to, he fought with the landlord for quite a long time to be able to retain the apartment, and that's how the yeshiva started. And he started and he made it into official yeshiva, and it grew under his son, Rav Mishua's watch till today. Another child of the Brisker Rov was his daughter, Lifsheh, who I also mentioned earlier. She was quite a personality, a very strong personality, a very, product of her father. She actually, in the early 1940s, she was the woman of the house. There was no mother. She took care of her father during the first years in Israel. She would cook. She ran the house. There's no mother or wife. And, like I said, the Rav himself was a bit broken. And there were older singles in the house. It wasn't the most ideal situation. And she ran it. She was able to make it a somewhat a regular home. And she later on, after the war, married Rav Michel Feinstein. And Rav Michel Feinstein was a close student of the Brisker Rov from his Meir days. When he was in the Meir, he was part of that group in the Meir that went to study by the Brisker Rov, which was common for the senior students at the Meir Yeshiva in the 1930s. And Rav Michel Feinstein himself, his father had passed away when he was very young. He was a young boy. And he grew up by his uncle, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and also by his other uncle, Rav Mordechai Feinstein. Rav Mordechai Feinstein was the rabbi, Rav Moshe Feinstein's brother was the rabbi in Shklov. And he remained in Russia even after Rav Moshe Feinstein left, and he and his family were killed by the Nazis. But in any event, Rav Michel Feinstein goes on to study in the Slutsk Yeshiva, and then later when it crosses the border in Kletsk, and then in Mir, and then in Mir for quite some time, for many years, and then for a period of time by the Brisker Rov. And he escapes at the beginning of the war, like most of the Mir Yeshiva, to Japan. But in Japan, he's able to get to the United States. He doesn't go to Shanghai with the rest of the Mir, like some of the other Mirs. Some of the Mirs made it straight to America in 1941. And he gets a position eventually by his uncle in MTJ. He becomes Rebbe there. For a period of time, he was actually in Boston, by the yeshiva that Rav Soloveitchik started in Boston, called... I forgot exactly what it's called, Rav Yeshivas, Reb Chaim, or Rabbeinu Chaim Halevi. Gets named after his grandfather, Reb Chaim Brisker. So he was there for a couple of years. He was a Rebbe there. He was kind of the Rosh Yeshiva there for a period of time. And then he's back in MTJ. And he eventually goes to Israel right after the war in 1946. And he marries the Brisker Rov's daughter. Of course, he had no family. No one was there by his wedding on his side. They all came pretty much for the Brisker Rov. So Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, who was his Rebbe back in Slutsk, walked him down to the chuppah. So he comes back to America. He moves with his wife. And Lifsheh Lifsheh had the distinction of being the only child of the Brisker Rov who lived in the United States for several years, which did not continue as a policy with her children, to say the least. But Rav Michel Feinstein was spent several years as a Rebbe at MTJ with his uncle. But the Rav was not happy about him being an American. He kind of forces him to come back to Israel. In fact, Rav Michel Feinstein tells him, I'm needed in America. In Israel, in Bnei Brak, you have the Chazoin Ish. In Yerushalayim, you have you, the Brisker Rov. It's a full. They have everyone. But I'm needed in America. But he comes back in 1952. And I always wondered, perhaps because of this saying that he said to his father-in-law about about where he's needed. Perhaps that's why he moved to Tel Aviv. I don't know why, I'm not sure, but he did move to Tel Aviv, and he opened the yeshiva there, and he's there for well over 20 years. And only in the 1970s he moves to Bnei Brak. He lived a very long life, deep into his 90s, and Rebbetzin Lifsheh lived even longer. She only passed away several years ago. In fact, in Tel Aviv connection, so the Brisker Rov, when he would go to the beach in the summer, he would go to the beach in Tel Aviv. In fact, one time I was in the Mir Yeshiva when I was a bacher. I was in the dorm, and I had a Brisker friend, and it was the summertime. It was around now in August, and he asked me what I'm doing that day. I said I'm going with a couple of guys to the beach. He said, which beach? I said, at Tel Aviv. So he goes, the Brisker Rov went to the Tel Aviv beach, so I guess that's why you should go. I said, no, I'm just going because it's convenient, and I'm not going at all just because the Brisker Rov went. But that's how the Briskers, interact. One of the most interesting children of the Brisker Rov, one of the most important stories, an active son of the Brisker Rov was Rav Rephoel Soloveitchik. He was literally his father's right-hand man and everything. He was a sickly as a child, so he didn't even go to the cheder in Brisk. So he was always under his father's direct care. He's the activist of the family. He took care of his father and everything. The Brisker Rov in his last months, Rav Rephoel Soloveitchik couldn't even live at home. He barely slept because his father needed him and literally couldn't do anything without him. As soon as he would walk out of the room, the Brisker Rov would say, Who is Rephoel? Where is he? He always needed him. He couldn't do it. He needed him for everything. And, in the early years, the Brisker Rov, it's hard to believe, he barely had a minyan in his house for the early years. And Rephoel had to always go out to make sure he got a minyan with him. Rephoel was the one who accompanied his father on his daily walks around the neighborhood, all the way down David Yellen Street up to Davidka Square and that whole area. The Brisker Rov would always walk. Rephoel would blow the shofar for him. He would take care of his matzahs. He would take care of his food throughout the year, his shchita and his Pesach stuff and his Shemitah, all these stringencies that the Brisker Rov had about the Shemitah fruits and everything. So the Rephoel was in charge of doing that and getting his dalad minim, the esrog and the lulav for sukkahs, everything. Rephoel was actually the main one involved in writing up and printing the Brisker Rov Sfarim, and he was an amazing person. He was very wise. He was very known for his advice and counsel he gave others. He was known as an address for shalom bayis, for marital issues. People would come to him. He had one daughter who married a fellow named Reb Sanel Meyerson, I believe. And Reb Rephoel Soloveitchik lived on Rehov Strauss, in between Kikar Shabbos of Geula Meir Sharm and Hanaviim towards Bikur Cholim Hospital. And he said, I can't ever move away from Rehov Strauss because people from Yerushalayim, they're right across the street from his house. There was the Yerushalayim Bnei Brak taxi service, and people who were waiting for a taxi there would come by to his house for a drink, and they relied on it. And people from down the block, they were with relatives who were sick in the Bikur Cholim hospital. They had an address to come to, and he was such an actively involved in every type of chesed that he wanted to be able to stay there, so people would always have an address to go to. He was a fiery fighter for all the important issues facing the religious community in Israel in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He led the demonstrations against the secular Zionist government, which in his eyes was doing all kinds of things that he felt needed to be demonstrated against, for desecration of graves and desecration, Chil Shabbos, and all kinds of things. But what he became very famous for actually was during the autopsy scandals in the 1960s and 70s, fighting to stop autopsies and smuggling bodies out of hospitals. He literally had an army working for him, and he would organize, and he was a fiery speaker and very dynamic, and he was his living room was the place where it all would get planned. And In fact, but it also, even in that, in all his fightings and all his public persona like that, he was a brisker. He was the son of the Brisker Rov, and it all went with a certain wisdom and a certain calm and a certain rationale and clarity. He wasn't a Yerushalmi. He was a brisker. He was a Soloveitchik. It's a big, big difference. I'll just give you one example. There was a big demonstration about autopsies that got violent. And there's always going to be, that in a big crowd and a demonstration that goes violent. And we understand how demonstrations work today. We see it all around here, both in Israel and the United States in these days. So someone hit a cop in the eye with a rock, and he actually lost his eye. It was a pretty bad hit, which was not Rav Rephoel's way. He never condoned violence, and that wasn't his way of doing things. So what does Rav Rephoel Soloveitchik do? He goes to visit this policeman in the hospital, and he speaks to him, and he helps him out, and he paid for his rehabilitation, and he was so warm and so forthcoming with this police officer that this police officer, second police officer, who lost his eye because of some wild guy at a demonstration, he writes to Rav Rephoel Soloveitchik a letter forgiving him for what he did, for what happened, not for what he did. He didn't do it. And Rav Rephoel Soloveitchik would carry it in his jacket for the rest of his life, and his family found it after he had passed away in his jacket. He took care of all the lost souls in the neighborhood, neighbors, whether they're religious or secular. There's literally endless stories with him. On his gravesite, where he's buried next to his father in Har HaMenuchos, they wrote that he's the Rav HaChesed, which is the exact thing that they wrote about his grandfather, Reb Chaim Brisker. He's the Rav HaChesed. He's someone who totally personified Chesed. He's actually named Rephoel for his great-grandfather, Rephoel Shapiro of Velvalleh. There's a book about him. There's an entire book about him. It's written in very lousy English, even worse than mine, but the content is amazing. So if you can get past the language, then it's very, very good content. And he was actually the only live person that the Satmar Rav would quote in his speeches, in the Rephoel Soloveitchik. He was, just to give you an example, there's 100 stories with him about the chesed he would do. I'll give you one. He would correspond with an elderly Holocaust survivor woman from Chicago, and he helped her take care of all kinds of things for her in Israel, including when it came time for her to buy a burial plot. So she called up Rephoel and asked him if he can help her. So he went around to the different Chevra Kadishas and he found prices for her on Har HaZeisim and Har HaMenuchos. And then he sat down with her with this spreadsheet and said, this is the price range and this is what it is. You can get here and get there, and this is what the view is like over here. There's endless stories about both his activism and his chesed, of how he cared for so many broken souls and from so many people from diverse backgrounds, people who were different from him. Think about that. He was someone who led the battle in so many areas of religious importance, and yet when it came to individuals, he had his heart for everyone. But perhaps we'll return to him and say a few more stories about him at a future opportunity. There was another son of the Brisker Rov who unfortunately had a breakdown. He was Reb Chaim, named after, of course, his grandfather, Reb Chaim Brisker. And they used to call him Reb Chaim der Rovs, the Rovs in the possessive sense. He was Reb Chaim, the son of the Brisker Rov. And he grew up without a mother, and his mother was murdered in the Holocaust in a very tragic way. So that might have contributed to his breakdown. And there was always a legend that it was because his mother was murdered in front of him, in front of his eyes, which is obviously not true because he left Europe with his father, and it was long before his mother was killed. In any event, he's one of those personalities that if you really want stories about him, you have to contact your nearest yeshiva guy, because this is, when you think about what do yeshivish guys talk about late night in the dormitory, very often it's stories or legends or both about Reb Chaim the Rovs, about all kinds of stories about him that may or may not have happened. So ask your favorite yeshiva guy for some classic dorm room hak, and you'll get some great stories about Reb Chaim the Rovs. He never married, in fact, one of the legendary stories about him is that he almost married a girl once, and the girl actually said yes, she was interested in marrying him, but he said no. They said, you're finally able to get married. Someone agrees to marry you. So he says, I thought about it, and I said, if she's willing to marry me, I'm a little crazy. So if she's willing to marry me, she must be crazy. I don't want to marry someone who's a meshugana. And there was one of the classic stories about him is that someone saw him pushing a baby carriage, a baby stroller, and when peering inside, there was a sefer inside. And again, fill in the blank of your favorite sefer. And asked him, why are you pushing the sefer in a baby carriage? He said, I was learning a piece in this sefer, and I didn't really appreciate what he was saying. I didn't like it, and I feel he was speaking like a baby, so I figured I'll give him a ride in the baby stroller. But let's move on to another child of the Brisker Rov, Rav Meir, who just passed away recently. He was one of the youngest children. He got married just a couple of months before his father passed away to a Benedict from Bnei Brak. And it's interesting because that Shabbos Sheva Brachos that he got after he got married in Bnei Brak became very famous. It was in the Vagshal, the old Vagshal Hall in Bnei Brak, and it was a major event in Bnei Brak history because the Brisker Rov came for Shabbos. And the Brisker Rov was a mythical figure even in his own lifetime. And that Shabbos was something special. People from all over Bnei Brak came to speak to him, just to see him. It was shortly before he passed away. He was already elderly and not well. And in fact, there's a story along that Shabbos that the refrigerator in the Vagshal Hall, the Brisker Rov, so goes the story. Go figure if any of these stories are true. But that the Brisker Rov wouldn't take used food from that fridge. So of course the rumor went around that it was because it was using electricity and it wasn't on a generator, and the Brisker Rov was very stringent about these Shabbos matters. He did not want to use it. When in fact, the reason that he didn't use it is because he found out that the temperature in the fridge was not high. It was not high enough, so he felt that the food was not being kept cold, and therefore he was suspicious that the food might be spoiled. Or something like that. Anyways, I'm probably messing up the details of the story. But Rav Meir Soloveitchik also had a yeshiva. He was a very personable individual. I met him a couple of times. And that brings us to Yibad L'chaim, the Brisker Rov's children who are still alive. We still have a couple of children of the Brisker Rov still alive with us, and may they live and be well for many, many more healthy years to come. Rav Dovid Soloveitchik, who also has a yeshiva, may he live and be well. So he married a Sternbach, a daughter of Rab Asher Sternbach from England. Rab Asher Arieli, my Rebbe in the Mir Yeshiva. So he's named for his grandfather, Rab Asher Sternbach, because another Sternbach daughter married Reb Chaim Yaakov Arieli, Rab Asher's father. So this is Rab Asher's uncle. So Rab Asher Arieli told me a couple of stories of interactions he had with his uncle, Rab Dovid. It's interesting, Rab Dovid was neighbors with another Rab Dovid, Rab Dovid Kohen, Rab Dovid Cohen, the Rav HaNazir, the close student of Rav Kook and the Rebbe in the Rosh Yeshiva in Merkaz HaRav. And after the 6 Day War, the Rav HaNazir brought a stone from the Har HaBayis and showed it to Rab Dovid, and Rab Dovid went wild. He went running. He didn't want to touch it. He didn't want to look at it. The Briskers, even when they go to the Kaisel, they don't touch the wall. They're nervous that perhaps it's part of the Har HaBayis and they can't, when they're tamei, they can't come too close, so they stay away with a certain awe, certain respect, and they don't come too close to the kaisel. So the legend goes that the Reb Dovid Soloveitchik can't move out of his apartment. He has to stay there because when he got married, his father, the Brisker Rov, visited him there, and he pointed to a certain spot and says, "This is where dokim and sinin de menorah. This is where you can light your Hanukkah candles." So he knows that this place you can light. And who knows if there's another place in the world that you could. So therefore, he is staying in that apartment until further notice. Rav Asher Arieli once told me, it was after Shir, and we were all asking him questions. Rav Asher, after the Shir, is like a football huddle after every Shir where you ask him questions. And Rav Asher brought in support of something he was saying. He brought a proof that he deduced from a Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos of the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnayos. And Rav Asher pointed out, I'm bringing a proof from this Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos only from the Rabbi Yichya Kapach version of the Mishnayos. The Rambam wrote the Pirush HaMishnayos in Arabic, and Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon translated it from Arabic into Hebrew, and that's what we have. But along came a Yemenite scholar in modern times and did a retranslation from the original manuscript in Arabic, and came out with a different translation and a lot of different words and a lot of different language that the Rambam seemingly uses when using Rabbi Kapach's translation. And of course, since it's new, since it's modern, so some people are suspicious of the Kapach translation. So the Rav Asher emphasized the proof I'm bringing is only according to the Kapach, Harav Kapach, that's how he called him, his translation. And so someone in this huddle made like some sort of face, like, oh, you're using the modern translation. So Rav Asher noticed that this smirk that this one made, it wasn't me, by the way. And Rav Asher said that my uncle Rav Dovid, the Feter Rav Dovid, he in the beginning did not want to use the Kapach Mishnayos until he, after trial and error a couple of times, he found out that the Kapach Mishnayos was more accurate. And he said, Rav Asher finished off, and he said, "Und jetzt the Feter jeden Mal bet the Pirush Mishnayos nor von Harav Kapach." And my uncle asked for the Pirush Mishnayos. He only wants from Harav Kapach. So there's lots to say about Rav Dovid. There's loads of stories, but he's contemporary, and we only deal in history here. So we'll go for a minute to the youngest child of the Brisker Rov, the Rebbetzin Rivka, the wife of Reb Yankel Schiff. May they both live and be well. And she was very young when they came to Israel. Her mother was killed, and the Rav was very devoted to her. He would play with her, he would sing with her, and he would take care of her every need. It's important to emphasize that because people have this certain stern image of the Brisker Rov, and he was this incredibly devoted father and understood that his children had a lot of challenge, the younger children had challenge because they didn't have a mother in the home, and he literally would try to fill that void. In fact, he did that for his grandkids too. Some of the Brisker Rov's grandchildren related that he would make paper airplanes for his grandchildren and play with them. Another interesting thing about the Brisker Rov, before I get back to his daughter Rivka. So on one of his walks, one time he was walking up from first to where he lived on Rehov Press up to Rehov Yeshayahu, then he made a right onto Rehov David Yellen. So there was an elderly woman who she was hanging out her rugs to clean, and she didn't recognize the Brisker Rov. She saw a man in the street. And the Rav always walked with an umbrella, either a cane or an umbrella. So she asked the Rav, "Can you help me bang out my rugs?" And so he went ahead and banged out her rugs with his umbrella. Spent a few minutes. The woman calls out in Hebrew, "Adoni, Adoni, mister, can you help out, bang out my rugs?" And the Brisker Rov complied. He said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." And she thanked him. She said, "Thank you so much." And the person accompanying the Brisker Rov said, "You're just going ahead and do that. You're the Brisker Rov." And he said, "It's chesed. Why can't I do some chesed? It's not a big deal." And so also, again, one of the good stories about the human side of such great people and what made them so great. So Rabbi Yankel Schiff, I once had the privilege of speaking to him, and he told me that his father was Harry Schiff from Dumbrava in Galicia. And Rabbi Yankel Schiff was impressed that I had heard of Dumbrava. And so it's interesting. He came from a Galicianer background. And Rabbi Yankel Schiff's older brother, Reb Shia Schiff, married the daughter of Reb Shaga Feivel Mendelovich in Tarvidas, who was Hungarian. And Rabbi Yankel Schiff, married a Litvak. So you have the Galicianers, they go both ways, either to the Hungarian side or the Litvak. So Rabbi Yankel Schiff himself was a student at Yeshiva Tarvidas, and then of Reb Aaron Cutler in Lakewood. And at that point, he was suggested to marry the Rav's youngest daughter. This is while the Rav was still alive. I don't think he was married when the Rav was still alive, but at least the shidduch was suggested. And when he came to Israel to meet the Brisker Rov's daughter, this Rebbetzin Rivka, so while he was being checked out, he hung around the Meir Yeshiva. So again, the Meir wasn't able to, the Briskers couldn't do anything without the Meir. And Reb Lezer Yudel Finkel, the Meir Yeshiva, hosted him, while the Brisker Rov's sons checked him out and made sure he's good enough for their sister. He's a very special man, Rabbi Yankel Schiff. He's completely devoted to his asmada, to his devotion, and complete dedication to learning his entire life. There's definitely more to say. I went about 20 minutes over time again, so hopefully we'll get to more in a part 2. So this was Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageberer.com for questions, comments, sources, sponsorships, lectures, virtual tours, and subscribe to his Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean and follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.